Welcome to another oral history interview in Missouri State University's Ozarks Voices series. I'm Tom Peters, the Dean of Libraries at MSU. Today is Monday, September 8th, 2014. Our special guest today is David Harrison, an author, an educator, and a scientist. David, welcome.
Thank you so much. I'm glad to be here.
This interview is being conducted in David's home here in Springfield, Missouri. So, David, let's start with when and where were you born?
I was born here in Springfield, March 13, 1937. My mother and dad and I lived here until I was not quite 5. Then we moved to Ajo, Arizona, A-J-O, Ajo. That was one of many Phelps Dodge Mining Corporation communities. There was a huge strip mine, copper strip mine. And Dad had a friend from here who had already gone out to find work there, and he mailed Dad a letter, I guess, or maybe called him and said, "You really need to come out. This is a good company to work for," and all that. We migrated. I thought my life was ruined. I can remember sobbing bitterly as we left town and looking out the rear window and thinking my life was pretty much just awful.
And you were 5.
I was 5.
Yeah.
I didn't want to leave.
Yeah.
So we arrived in Ajo, and it didn't take me long to discover the West and all the romantic elements of the West, and cowboy boots and singing Western songs and all that. And we were there for not quite 5 years. And then the war ended. Second World War was over. All of a sudden, 1945, and my dad had a friend still here who was a carpenter by trade, and Bill called my dad and said, "You have to come back to Springfield. The war is over. All the GIs are coming home. All the guys are going to need houses, and Springfield needs a block plant." So we reversed ourselves, and I sobbed when I left Arizona because my life was pretty much ruined. But by the time we got back here, things settled down, and Dad and 2 other fellows started what they called the Glenstone Block Company. And not surprisingly, it's located on Glenstone. I can remember my first job there was sickling weeds on the front end of the lot. Anyway, the company prospered over, slowly over a long period of time. And my dad ran that. He wound up being the surviving partner. He ran it from 1945 to 1973. At that point, Tom, I was in Kansas City. I'm skipping over some science. I'll get to that, but we can circle back around. I was in Kansas City at Hallmark Cards, and I was the editorial manager there, working with editors and writers who put together the line of greeting cards. And I had a call from my father, and he said, "I would like to retire. Would you be interested in returning to Springfield and take over the company?"
Were you the only child, or?
I have a younger sister,
Okay.
but I was 15 before Julie came along,
Okay.
so I was an only child, and then after I left home, she was an only child, so it worked out. And so I ran the Glenstone Block Company then from 1973 to 2008, when I eventually decided I had enough being a businessman, and I wanted to write full-time. So I sold the company, and I've been writing full-time since.
Wow. Okay. So just a couple of side questions. Do you always sob before you have to move? Does that continue on?
I haven't sobbed lately. But
Well, you're never too old to sob, I think. So, and then when you went out to Arizona, I'm guessing you probably drove at least part of the way on Route 66. We were chatting before we started the camera.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Do you have any memories of traveling on Route 66?
Not as,
either out or back, probably both directions.
Oh, yeah, sure, both ways. It was lots of little mom and pop places to eat and also to stay. all up and down the way. You didn't have to go too far without finding a place to stop for gasoline or to eat. And the motels, by and large, were just run by families.
Yeah.
And, there weren't too many chains.
Right.
So we developed the habit early on of never even thinking about making reservations because the road was good and you got there.
You could always
when
find
you
a
felt
place
like
to
stopping,
stay.
you stopped.
Yeah.
My only requirement was a swimming pool, so I could.
Yeah, I was the same way. It was all about the pool when I was.
Oh yeah. You couldn't stop if you didn't have a pool out front.
Right. Okay, so then you went to public schools here in Springfield, and then to Drury.
Yes.
And you were very interested in science.
I was. I think my interest probably began when before we left here, so when I was a very small child. My mother used to tell people about the time I caught a black snake and was playing with it when I was 3 or 4. And I never had much sense about being afraid of things like that. They fascinated me, and I wanted to know more about them and to get closer to them. I continued to do that in Ajo. One of my first memories there was the first home we lived in was sort of on stilts. The back of the lot was higher than the front, so the house had to be leveled, and you could pretty much walk in underneath. And we hadn't been there but just a few days, and all the parents were scaring my mother with, visiting, telling her to watch out for rattlesnakes and Gila monsters and
scorpions,
and all the rest, tarantulas. But I wound up, at that point I was an only child, and so to entertain myself, I got a mason jar and a lid and got in under the house and filled it with many of those same things. And so I guess I just always had that interest. So we moved back here. I'm in 3rd grade, Oak Grove Elementary School. They have 4-H there. And as my project, I started collecting insects. And from then until the time I was college age, I was pretty much a nature guy. And we lived on Elm Street, and I had 2 bedrooms upstairs. It was an old Dutch colonial home. It's still there, close to the corner of National and Elm. And when I'm sitting over there at Panera, I can look across and see my old house. And one of my bedrooms was for a bedroom, but the other was for my collections. And I had, all the walls were full of snake skins and animal hides that I had tanned, and shelf after shelf after shelf, and everything from seashells to fossils to, you name it.
Yeah.
So it seemed natural for me to become a biologist. And when I finished high school, it was an easy walk across the street to Drury, and I had some fellowships, I think 3 of them, later on to go at different universities to go into entomology. But in the end I chose, for whatever reason, parasitology at Emory after I finished Drury and went on to graduate school. So I studied a little, it's a cestode. It's not quite a tapeworm, but it's close. And it's called Hymenolopus diminuta, in case you want to make note of that.
Okay.
And it's found primarily in rats. So I used to think I was pretty smart, but then looking back and you think, okay, I'm studying parasites that are found primarily in rats. And now I'm about to graduate with honors. I wonder how many rats are going to be interested. As it turns out, none of them. So I had a wife and a new baby daughter, and I needed work. And I began to apply for a job as a parasitologist. One of the few companies that had an opening wasn't actually in parasitology, it was in pharmacology, and it was Meade Johnson in Evansville, Indiana. And so they called, and we talked and exchanged letters, and so I eventually went to Evansville for an interview. And, Dr. John Kissel said, Well, David, I see you have a lot of science. I don't notice any parasitology classes. You know, you tend to be more about biology and you have chemistry. He said, do you think you can do the work of a parasitologist? And I said, piece of cake. You know? Sure. So I took the job. I was delighted to have it. And then went home and started reading up on on pharmacology.
Yeah.
And but I did it, you know, learned.
Enjoyed it?
Got it done.
Yeah.
And but after a few years of that, my job was essentially to, well, they put me in the CNS department, the brain, the central nervous system, brain and spinal cord. And my group, there were 4 of us, spent all day, every day, working with organic compounds that were sent down to us by the chemist on the floor above. They were always tinkering with atoms, you know, throwing, or molecules, throwing a carbon on it or taking something off. And each variation had to be tested in laboratory animals. So we had to figure out how to get the chemical into solution. And then we started with mice and worked our way up. And if it just killed mice and that was all it did, then we went on to the next compound.
Any rats, perchance?
Yes. Well, I got to rats.
You got your revenge on the rats for not hiring you?
Got my revenge. I stuck a lot of them in the tail, I'll tell you that. But I guess when I really got tired of it was I'd gotten up to where my daily job was working with cats. And at the end of the day, they were always euthanized. What I did to them would not be something they could recover from. And these were all animals that were about to be put to death. They were bought from animal pounds and such. And it wasn't that I think their lives were lost in vain, because what I was doing and what a lot of people in that business do is fundamental. We have to do that. Otherwise, we're sticking needles in humans and doing goodness knows what to them. So it's absolutely necessary to do that kind of work. But I had sort of plateaued. I was a supervisor, and my very first person reporting to me, and I was 22 or 3 or whatever I was. But I needed to go up a notch. I needed a PhD in pharmacology if I wanted to continue to progress, and I was ambitious. But it would involve a lot of chemistry, and I just don't care for chemistry.
Yeah.
It was not one of my favorite subjects. So I decided it was a good time to look for something else. The last thing that happened to me before I left Drury was that I took one class in creative writing.
You almost forced to, if I remember correctly.
I was, for a fact. I didn't intend to. I had no desire to, but the dean of Drury told me just before I started my last semester that I had too much science and not enough balance, and that I needed to do something else. And he didn't care what, as long as it was not science. So I went whining to my my advisor, and Dr. Laura Bond, who was a wonderful woman, great advisor, a fine professor of biology. And so she helped me select some things from the college catalog for that last semester. And one of them was a creative writing class. And I didn't object to it, really, because I'd always liked words. I grew up doing that. I made up poems before I could write, just for the fun of it. But once I got into this class, and all these other students had the requisites for that, I didn't. I was kind of thrown in cold turkey. And I was very concerned, because they were talking talk that I didn't understand, and they were talking about the plays they were working on and all these other things. But eventually I did squeeze off one story about a wasp and a spider I'd watched. And at the end of the semester, the fellow who taught it, Dr. Clark Graham, not Graham Clark from College of the Ozarks, famed Graham, Clark Graham, encouraged me to become a writer. He said he thought I had a strong, a strength in working with words. He enjoyed having me as a student and patted me on the shoulder. He said, I know you're going to go into science, but I hope you won't overlook this possibility. Well, that really stuck, and I'll never know why. But it suddenly became an important idea.
Yeah.
And I kept asking myself if I thought I could.
Yeah.
And of course I was in graduate school for a while, so until I finished at Emory, I really didn't have much time to pursue it. But once I finished Emory, and Sandy and I, with Robin, our child, settled in Evansville so I could work for Me Johnson. And it didn't take long after that before at night, well, my routine was go to work, do what I did, bring home journals to read to continue to improve my knowledge about what I had just accepted to do for a living. And then after all that, and Sandy would be down for the night, the baby would be asleep, I would sit there and try to be a writer and try to imagine what I was supposed to be doing to be a writer. Mm-hmm. I didn't know what kind of writer I wanted to be or could be or should be. And what I had done in class in Drury was to write a story. So the guy who taught the class said I was okay, and so maybe that's what I was supposed to do. Mm-hmm. And I like to read short stories. Mm-hmm. You know, Hemingway and Updike and all the stories that were being around. And then there was what they call the black humor at that point. Bruce Friedman and Kurt Vonnegut and Terry Southern and a lot of good writers who were coming at it from a very different point of view. So I read a lot. And then I would work on a story. And now I had no teacher, no one to tell me if this were an A or a C or what. And my only recourse was to show it to Sandy. And Sandy's a straight shooter. She was, at that point, she was teaching high school English and Spanish. And so I would finish a story and show it to her and beg her, I'm sure, with my eyes to like it. But what I got was what she thought, and she was always kind and always sweet, but always honest. And so I never had high hopes when I sent one of those stories off that anybody else would like it any more than she did.
But you did send some off. You sent
I sent them off.
Quite a few off to.
I have a record to this day. My first story that I sent was in 1959, and I can't think of the name of it offhand, but I can tell you by looking at the records how long it was and how much the postage was and how many places I sent it, because unfortunately it kept coming home like the swallows at Capistrano. And so while that was in play, I finished a second story, showed it to Sandy. It's kind of the same story, second verse, and I would get that out. Mm-hmm. And pretty soon I was up to a dozen or more stories, all in circulation. They kept bouncing back, and I would have a list all prepared, and I knew where I was going to send the next one. And it became a routine. And so we were in Evansville 3 years. I hadn't sold anything, and at the time I finally decided I really did need to try something else, because I didn't much want to go back to school to get a PhD that would require some subjects that weren't particularly of interest to me. I was offered free rides. I had a couple of opportunities to go get the PhD at no cost, so maybe I should have. But instead, I started applying around the country trying to find. I thought maybe if I found something more flexible by day, more creative, more interacting with people, because I spent my whole day with mice and cats, rats and cats.
Central nervous systems of various ilks.
And mostly they were asleep, or I put them that way.
So it's really the people rather than the words. I was going to say, well, you transitioned from rats to words, but it really was the people and the interaction.
Yeah, I just felt like, and I really liked the guys I worked with in the lab. But I mean, we were all very individually assigned to things, and so during the day you talk at lunch, but I might be sitting this close, and yet not have much opportunity to visit a lot.
Yeah.
It was pretty serious work and had to be witnessed and signed at the end of the day, and all those things had to be logged away.
Yeah.
So Hallmark Cards was one of the few companies, and I must have applied to 50. Mm-hmm. One of the few companies that actually responded. And they did so because I had mentioned that I was a wannabe writer. Mm-hmm. And so one of the ironies there is that I had a vacation coming, so we were about to come back home here. Mm-hmm. And not long before that, I had sent my letter to Hallmark in response to their come on. And I felt pretty good. And so we got here to Springfield, and I hadn't heard back from Hallmark yet. And I got in touch with my contact at Hallmark, and I said, well, I'm a lot closer right now. I'm on vacation. What if I just run up there and we can meet? And so they said, fine. And so Sandy and I went up, planning to be there that day and drive back that night. Mm-hmm. And they introduced me to the vice president of Human Resources at Hallmark. And we visited for quite a while, Bill Harsh, mm-hmm. a fine guy. And he brought me over to the vice president of editorial, Webster Schott. So we talked. And we were waiting for a guy, the vice president of research, but he was out of town. Mm-hmm. And they really were planning to place me in research. That was they figured I'm coming from research. Mm-hmm. But I had to wait overnight for that. So we went and got toothbrushes and stuff. So I wound up back with the vice president of editorial the next day, and he offered me the job, and I took it. Hmm. So we came back to Springfield, said our goodbyes to parents and family, and went back home to Evansville so I could make the announcement that I had accepted a job at Hallmark Cards. And we were checking the mail when we got home, and there was a rejection letter from Hallmark that I never knew I had. It arrived after I left town, and they had sent me a letter and said, after sober reflection, we appreciate your interest in Hallmark, but we don't think it would be a good fit.
So you're getting some mixed messages from Hallmark.
Well, what happened was that they were so impressed that even though they had turned me down, I wanted the job enough that I was willing to drive up there. And I said, I was totally ignorant of all that. Yeah. And sometime later, my new boss, this web shop, was telling somebody else in my presence, he said, here's a fellow who wanted to work here so much that he wouldn't take no for an answer. And I just let them think that. They never did know that not in a million years would I have done that.
Oh, that's a great story.
So 3 more years passed, and I still hadn't sold a story. So
this is kind of the mid-'60s now?
Yeah, I started there in 1964, maybe, or 5, something like that. Mm. And I worked there altogether 10 years. I guess it was 62. But after a total of 6 years of trying to be a writer, and the rejections were piling up, I didn't keep them. I'm sorry I didn't. I wish I had. I tell people today, frame at least one. Yeah. That's your badge of courage. That people can see, oh, you're really doing it. You're trying. Yeah. But it burns and hurts every time you get one, at least at first, especially. So I didn't keep them, but I of course kept a record of them. Mm-hmm. And so a story, and I was still writing stories for adults and for magazines and such.
So that's how you thought I'm I'm going to try short stories for adults through the magazine.
That's where I started, and after that...
This was kind of the heyday of magazine short stories. They were paying pretty good money for those stories.
Yes, which is one of the things I was attracted to. One of my stories won a Bob's Merrill fellowship or scholarship to Bloomington University of Indiana, a summer workshop. And Hallmark popped for the rest of the expenses. That was very nice of them. So I took a course that summer under Kurt Vonnegut and Anya Seton. She was the history writer. And Harry Mark Petrakis, who was the short story writer, who had worked to try to sell a story to the Atlantic Monthly. And I've forgotten how many years, but I do remember how many stories he wrote, 100. 100 times he sent stories to that same magazine, and eventually started getting little notes saying, "Way to go, man, keep sending them," that sort of thing. So Petrakis had a story even more gruesome than mine. And but he was my my model. You know, I thought, well, okay, I'll keep going then too, and I certainly profited by listening to those very, very good, successful writers. And not too long after that, I had a story that did win something, and I was interviewed by the Kansas City Star. And I don't know how it happened now, but someone who read that article and I got to talking, and she wondered if I wrote only for adults or if I wrote for children. I said, no, I pretty much focus on stories for adults. So she said, I find that curious, because at that moment it was in the paper that I was the children's greeting card editor. And actually I was the product manager for children's products. I started as the children's editor. And so I got to thinking about that, and it makes certain sense, then maybe I should give it a go. And it was harder than I expected it to be. I thought, well, writing for kids, you know.
Yeah.
But it took a long time, weeks, maybe months, trying to think of an idea that I kept rejecting my own ideas. I kept thinking, well, that's an old thing, oh, that's been done. And I felt a new kind of responsibility. When you're writing for adults, presumably they're smart enough, experienced enough to tell the wheat from the chaff, and then to make their own deductions. And okay.
So writing for children was a bigger challenge than you originally anticipated.
Yeah, once I began to think about kids, then you start having these little people on your shoulders saying, well, you know, if you're going to write for kids, what are you going to tell them? Because they're going to believe whatever you say. And not only that, if you don't tell them in a way that is, you don't want to wink over their heads, you're not writing to their moms and dads, you're writing to them. Well, if you're writing to a 5-year-old child, what is that 5-year-old like? What's the world like to him or to her? And you know, I can remember sobbing on my way to Arizona. That's one thing. But then I also collected scorpions. So I began to really focus for the first time on my audience and realize that there's a lot of responsibility. And that slowed me down, and it should. It should slow us all down. And eventually I thought of music, because I had been a musician along the way in my earlier years. And I thought, well, they always say to write about what you know, and I knew music, so I thought, okay, maybe I can write something that has a tune to it, a lyric to it, or a meter to it, a rhyme to it. And but I played the trombone, and I defy you to rhyme many things with trombone and meter.
Well, I take that as a challenge. I'll take that up.
So what came out was the boy with a drum instead of the boy with a trombone. And I finished the story and sent it off. And, well, first of all, my wife liked it, so that was a shock.
Did you have an agent, or was this,
No.
you were just and you didn't belong to any kind of writers group or anything? You were just,
I did it all the hard way,
Yeah.
and probably the wrong way, but it was my way, as they say. Frank Sinatra would have been proud.
There you go.
And darn if it didn't sell. It sold to Western Publishing. Sorry. It sold to Western Publishing for $300, I believe it was. And it could have been $350. Well, the most I'd ever earned writing stories for magazines was maybe $75. Sometimes not that much. So I jumped at it. By then we were living in Kansas City, as I said, and I was pretty happy camper. I finally sold something that was really some money back in that period of time, 1967.
Yeah.
Now, what they sent me to sign was a purchase form. Again, in my blissful naivete, I didn't even perceive that wasn't the norm. That there were, I didn't really understand royalty, that how that worked. All I knew was here they had written in $300, and it was going to be all mine, and it was for a story that had come out of here. And so I did a little, happy dance, and Sandy said, "Would you like to quit Hallmark and write full time?" She said, "I'm teaching. We'll get by, and I'll give you a couple of years off if you want to do that." So I will forever be in her debt for that. Naturally, I didn't do it. I grew up in a family where Dad was never without a day's work in his life, and I couldn't imagine doing that. And so I kept on working at Hallmark by day and chasing my dream at night. And so I wrote another book for kids, and it did okay. And I think about maybe the third one was called the Book of Giant Stories. And the reason I wrote that was because my editor at the original publishing company moved, as editors are wont to do, and she moved to American Heritage Press in New York City, and sent me a letter and said, "I'd really like to do something with you here. Do you have any ideas?" Sandy and I went to New York to see some plays, and while we were there, I made a date to go see that editor. So we sat in her office and brainstormed, and she said, "What I'd really like is maybe a storybook." She said, "Could you write more than one story on the same subject?" So I said, "Well, how about giants?" And she was from Europe, and she said, "Oh, we love giants." So I went back to Kansas City and began to make a list of possible giant story ideas. And I think I had something like 36 before I finally I thought I had enough. I only needed 3 stories. And so I would go through and I would have my little secret ballot, and get it down to maybe 16 on the list, and kept going down until I finally got down to the 3 that I just really had to write, and I did. And I sent her the first one, and she loved it, and so I thought, okay, we're on the right track, and sent her the second one, just the same thing. Third one, perfect. She knew of an Italian artist that she was just really wanted to use, and so she sent it to him. I don't remember his name. Anyway, he had it for about a year or so, and still hadn't started. So she took it back from him and sent it to a Frenchman, Philippe Fix. I don't know how he would pronounce that, but I'm sure he just butchered it. So Philippe also kept it for a long time, but he was working on it. And when I finally got the book, it was just glorious. Absolutely fantastic artwork. I didn't know what to expect, but I was just blown away by it. And right away, good things started happening. It was co-published by division of Random House in England. And in the meantime, McGraw-Hill had just swallowed up American Heritage Press, but it was still in the family. So foreign rights started popping up, and translations, and I was totally innocent, but my editor kept calling and sending letters and saying, well, you're not going to believe this, but it's going to be in Spanish, or it's going to be in French, or it's going to be in German, or Japanese, or Chinese, and then I had by then had my phone call from my dad wanting me to leave Hallmark if I would consider that, to come back to Springfield and take over the family business so that he could retire.
So this was early 70s?
This was 1973, yeah. He called in 72, last part of 72, in October. So I came in February, first week in February in 1973. Well, so I had given my notice to Hallmark when my editor called. I was still in Kansas City, but getting ready to move, and she said, "You just won the Christopher Award." I said, "Yes." I had no idea what it was. I mean, again, everything was new to me.
But by this point, did you really start to think, I mean, how did that transition from you were basically a parasitologist or a pharmacologist or a children's greeting card editor or to I'm really primarily an author, but I'm also a father and a husband and I need to provide, and I come from a people that think that, you know, being gainfully employed is a good thing, and
right.
You know, how, was that just an epiphany, or was it just a gradual transition?
Well, I think I had the epiphany before I could produce the goods. It was
it was an epiphanic promise, maybe, or
it was a pre-epiphany. Well, I think you have to buy into something in order to stay with it that long. And so even though I was, and again, I tell people this now too, you don't have to be published to be a writer. If you're thinking like one, acting like one, believe you are one, even if your work hasn't gotten to a certain level yet, you know, we're all bowlers, whether we're bowling a 100 average or 212 average. And so I think that's where I was I was probably about 125 average writer for a very long time.
But in an earlier interview, you commented that, you know, you thought practice and commitment were essential to being an author.
Yeah.
You know, that's, you know, like others, you just can't will it. You have to practice.
No, you have to do it. And who's it, Gladwell, who
Malcolm Gladwell
famously quoted that it takes 10,000 hours.
10,000 hours of practice, where the Beatles in Hamburg playing in dive bars all day long.
Absolutely. And so when I look back on 67 rejections before I sold the first one over 6 years, I don't know if that added up to 10,000 hours at that point, but it certainly was a good start on it. And of course, having gone on from there, at some point, yes, at some point you finally get to where you were meant to get to. And maybe at that point you get better, maybe you'll level off, I don't know. But at least it takes a while to mature as a writer. And I'm sure the same thing applies to just about any human endeavor, but I'm talking about writing, which seems deceptively difficult. People who don't write sometimes are shocked at how hard it is to make those words dance to your tune, because we all use the same words, and we all write grocery lists, and we all do the same thing up to a certain point. So yeah, I knew I was a writer, but I knew I was not published. And that was hard medicine, and I was filled with self-doubt, and I had never had much of that. I don't mean that I was arrogantly overrating myself, but but to fail again and again and again and again when I wanted to do it so much, and to have those rejection slips come back, and almost invariably it was not a comment on it, it was just a print thing, and here's the envelope that I had self-addressed and stamped, and here the darn thing is back, and I knew what was going to be in there. It was going to be in my manuscript because I could feel it, and that one wasn't even a full page most of the time, it was just a little slip. So it was hard to keep going, but after a certain point, you can't stop. You have too much of yourself invested in it. So if I had stopped, to this day, I would be wondering if I should have kept going. And so that's the way it worked.
So everybody's glad that you continued on, that you persevered. You didn't mention, but I read somewhere that A Boy with a Drum sold roughly 2 million copies.
Yeah, and that was the first one. That was The Boy with a Drum.
So if you just negotiated a royalty of 25 cents a sale, you...
Yeah, that was a little expensive.
Did you learn the hard lesson of the business of being an author?
Yes, and that's another whole aspect of it. And now again, if I had started with an agent, I don't know who would have wanted me in the beginning. That's something else that's hard to do. A lot of young writers or beginning writers start looking for an agent right off the bat, and I don't think agents are particularly interested in beginners. After all, they don't make any money if you don't, and if you're not good enough yet to start producing a significant income for them, then why waste all that time on their part? But so doing it yourself, you learn to wear a lot of hats.
Yeah. Have you ever had an agent in your career?
I tried an agent briefly back in the 80s. I had just finished during the, from 1982 to 1988, I served on the Springfield Public Schools Board of Education. It was just time-consuming enough that on top of everything else I was handling, my writing just went to heck. I had been kind of doing well as years passed, more and more books, and all of a sudden I would go home and there was nothing left in there except other things. And I wrote one decent book during those 6 long years, and it's still in print, and it's sold over 1 million copies. It's Wake Up Son. So I got it right once. So at some point I decided that maybe I needed an agent. I can't think of the gentleman's name, never met him, it was all by correspondence. He took me on based on my record. I sent him a story. He said he didn't think it'd sell, but he'd try. He was so right, both by the inference and the truth. And I think I sent him 2 others, and he placed one of them, but I could have done that. He placed it with somebody I knew. So after a year or so, I sent him a note, and so I'm not doing well here. I'm not producing good stuff. And he said, no, not really. And so he said, I think I need to take you on and manage everything. He said, I need to mold your career. I need to do this and do that. And I said, I don't want to be molded. I'm sorry, but I don't think this is going to work out. So we just agreed to split.
And that was it, huh?
That was it.
Between your own inner voice and Sandy, you really, having an agent wasn't that much of an additional value, it sounds like.
Yeah, and so by then I was, my gosh, I've been writing for decades, and I probably didn't, I shouldn't say I didn't need an agent. I suspect that good agents are extremely valuable, and most of my friends in the business would hardly put the shoes on without consulting their agent. They swear by them, they swear at them, but
I notice you have slip-ons on.
Yeah.
Keep it simple.
But I just have never gone that route. And,
Casual observation I've made, just anecdotal observation, is that people trained in the sciences often make very good writers. Nonfiction, fiction, children's authors.
That's true.
Why do you think that is?
Well, there are a lot of common characteristics between scientists, especially basic research scientists. Now, if you're assigned to solve a problem, that's one kind of science. If you are doing the kind of work where your mind is free to theorize about this or that and to then seek answers, and I was pretty good at that, by the way. I improvised a couple of tests that wound up with my name on them, and I first presentations I ever made, I made them as a scientist, and they flew me to San Francisco. It's some big deal, and I was up there on the stage with my hand quivering like this, trying to point to the big screen. But yeah, research shows that people who are creative can do well in either field, science or writing or art, but writing primarily. Yeah.
Now, I saw on your website that you have an impressive list of publications, 80 plus now, correct? Yeah. You did some pop-up books back in 1966 for Hallmark. Would you consider those your first publications, or was it The Boy with the Drum?
Well, The Boy with the Drum came out in 1969. I wrote it in 67. And I don't remember when those pop-ups...
66 it said on your website.
Okay, all right.
About 4 pop-up books.
Well, then they I guess they would have been technically my first publication.
Okay.
And I was, I think by then I was the department head, and I wanted to do. I don't know now whether I was where I was in the hierarchy, but I wanted to do some pop-up books, and I wanted to make them because it was all the rage at that point. And I wanted to make them very small. I wanted to have like the world's smallest pop-up book. And of course, they weren't. They were this size. But. Yeah. And we needed a set of 4. So I picked the subject I wanted. Of course, being the old biology came out. Something about the seas, something about the backyard, dinosaurs, and so on. And I assigned them to one of our writers on the staff, Mary Loberg. And Mary wrote the scripts, and they were basically okay, except that Mary didn't have my background. She didn't have the science background. So I saw bits and pieces that were not correct scientifically. So I wound up co-writing it with Mary, and she was very sweet about the whole thing. So we co-wrote those books. And yes, they were, and some of them are still around.
Yeah.
And ironically, I hadn't seen anything about Mary Loberg in all these years, and she popped up on Facebook as we sit here speaking about a week ago. And so I sent her a note, and I said, well, Mary, I just checked on Amazon, and one of our books is still up on Amazon. It's something like 5 or 6 million down the road.
Yeah, your early books still sell. The Boy with the Drum, there, you can only buy it through the used book market, but it's commanding a pretty good price.
Some of them are still on there.
Probably a bigger price than the original sticker price. So whether it's 66 or 69, you're coming up on 50 years of published work.
Right.
Are you planning any kind of a celebration? Are you gonna, if you travel, you're gonna wail about it?
No, I hadn't even thought about that, but that would be. Probably should have,
That's right.
have a little attaboy party of some kind.
Somewhere I read that you think that, especially poetry, is best experienced aloud, that a poem should be read to be enjoyed.
Oh, absolutely.
And this fascinates me because, I don't know much about the history of reading, but I remember reading that when St. Augustine was reading silently, it flummoxed his colleagues that he would be reading silently because that was kind of new in 800, AD 800. So the habit that we all sort of accept as normal of reading silently is still fairly, it's only a millennium, 1,200 years old. Yeah. So what do you think it is about the auditory process of hearing a poem read or a short story?
Yeah. Well, poetry began, I guess, as an oral method of conveying information, and you know, minstrels playing their instruments and that sort of thing, town criers. But it was to convey information, and for an illiterate audience, they had to commit some of that information to memory. That was their news, and the easiest way to do that was to put that information into some form that was easy to remember. Meter, a certain kind of beat, words that sounded similar or alike. Well, that's still the core of poetry. Everything else may have changed, but over time, poetry is just a throwback to those singular thoughts, those packets of information that the author wants to convey. And of course, we went through the explosion into free verse a while back, and many writers, many poets continue to feel more comfortable writing free verse. So today we have a fair amount of free verse being written, but we can't quite get rid of the versifiers. They just won't go away. And until I co-wrote a book with a professor from New York University back just, I think, 1998 or 9. Bernice Cullinan. Bernice was a crusty gal, as sweet as she could be, but I mean, she had very, very strong opinions. She was a former president of the International Reading Association and quite well known for her books on poetry. And but she also was the editor-in-chief for poetry at Boyd's Mills Press, which did my first poems. Mm-hmm. So Bea and I co-wrote this book on poetry in the classroom for teachers, and we fought from the very beginning about verse. And she said, kids in elementary schools are not capable of writing verse. They can only write free verse. I said, where in the world did you get an idea like that? Well, it was one of those received wisdom things. Somebody somewhere along the line said it, and everybody else repeated it. And she had repeated it in her books. So it made it very difficult for her to back up, because that made her wrong. Mm-hmm. And I didn't have that much skin in the game. I said, look, kids can write in rhyme. I said, I did that. I wrote a triplet, the very first thing out of my mouth when I was 6 years old. I said, don't tell me that they can't do that. Well, we got in a big fight over it. And our editor had a referee, and she wrote a very interesting foreword in the book about how much we had essentially scrapped over all this. Well, as it turns out, I was right. Bea admitted later that I was, and she appreciated the fact that I didn't back up. And she said the problem was I had been told that by somebody else, and I believed that it was too hard to write free verse if you're a kid. The person who started all that, I know, and she admitted later, she said, I said that because I didn't know how to write verse, and I didn't quite trust people who did. She said, I thought they had some mysterious information that I didn't have. So she took all that back, and the world kind of got right again. But the point is, we need both kinds, and to write long, serious poetry, sure, free verse is probably the way to go for most people. But my gosh, the world's full of wonderful poems that are in rhyme, are in meter, at least plain verse, at least iambic pentameter or something. Mm-hmm. And I like it all, but in every case, it needs to be read aloud, mm-hmm. and in my judgment. Mm-hmm. And that's especially true when you're writing for young people, because they are to learn. They do profit from hearing us intone the words, the cadence, knowing how and when to pause, all the inflections that go with our reading alone silently to ourselves as adults. When we have to read them aloud, especially in front of an audience, especially if we're the author of it, then we're giving the full measure of what we wanted you to hear. And kids love it, and they like to read poetry aloud too. Mm-hmm. So that's where I come from on that.
In one of your earlier interviews, you just said that adulthood is a prism. Not prison, but prism. Mm-hmm. If adulthood is a prism, what is childhood?
Well, it's a constantly changing environment, or situation, not environment. When you think about it, every generation is different. Mm-hmm. I mean, a 1-year-old is different from a 2-year-old, and that's not the same as being 3. Mm-hmm. And when I wrote a book several years ago called Connecting Dots, it was memory-based poems. I wanted to start with my earliest memory, but I couldn't do that. I had to start with maybe when I was 7th grade or something. Then I could work backward, and I could find finally myself as a 3-year-old, but I couldn't instantly bring that up. Once I got into all those, me and all those ages, I realized now how dramatically different each of those ages was. Yeah. So childhood is just a crazy sequence of changing.
Rapid process.
Rapid, yeah. And so if you're writing for young people, you better be aware of that, because very often when I'm trying to mentor somebody, I'll see some work that quite clearly is not appropriate for the presumed age, because the language is too mature, or it doesn't capture the experience of the typical 7-year-old or whatever. Sorry. Childhood can be an exciting place. In my case, it was a wonderful place. I had loving, supportive parents. I don't remember hearing them argue. They were always in favor of whatever I wanted to do, as long as I didn't hurt myself or somebody else. But I'm talking with a woman now who was one of my editors at Hallmark, a different one from the one I mentioned a while ago. And we too have just recently rediscovered one another on the internet. Her childhood was awful. She had a mother who was probably insane, who beat her with her fists. Mm-hmm. So this woman, as a child, had to tiptoe around the house when her mother was taking a nap for fear she'd awaken her. Mm-hmm. Well, guess what? This woman writes painful, serious poetry, free verse. Guess what? I write books for kids, and if I do write for adults, I have a sense of humor, and I my wife says, "How do you do that? How are you always up? How are you always?" I've always been that way, but that was my model at home. I grew up that way. So childhood is not only different from age to age, it's different from kid to kid. Yeah. And you throw all those youngsters into a classroom and say, learn it the same way, and learn the same pace, and here, teacher, here's another 5, 10 kids, and test them every other hour, and we'll be okay.
You've been a long advocate for literacy, and it's a big topic. What's your synopsis of why literacy is so important to human beings?
I guess from personal experience, growing up in a family that read and being able to read before I started school, I have a personal desire to see other people do what I like, and that's probably not exactly scientific, but you know, if I like it, you should like it. But from a research point of view, there is simply no question about the importance of early training in literacy. Kids who grow up parked in front of a TV set will have a TV vocabulary when they get to kindergarten. Kids who grow up with their parents or an older sibling, somebody reading to them, will have a more literate view of the world, plus a vocabulary to express themselves. Fewer than half of parents nationwide in this country read to their children under 5 on a nightly basis, or even a regular basis. And that drops with socioeconomic levels. So by the time you get to parents, neither of whom graduated from high school, that's something like 32% of those parents read to their children. About a third of the kids who reach school age are not yet prepared to learn, and there's a strong connection between the two. So the answer, you know, is to solve the problems at home, which we can't do. Plan B is to get as much reading experience involved as we possibly can for as many kids as we can reach. If parents don't know how to read, or if dad's on the road and mom's got 3 jobs, then listen to CDs and listen. But somehow or another, get some words inside those kids so they can grow up with a little bit of an idea rather than come to school and not know which way to turn the pages of a book. And those who come to school unprepared, unless they are, unless intervention is applied right away within the first 90 days or so, again, according to some research, they will probably be behind forever. The odds are against them catching up. By the time they do get caught up with first grade, they're in 2nd grade, and so on. And by the time they get to the 4th grade, then you can almost pick out your dropouts of the future. So the great leveler, the free opportunity,
proven essential skill,
is just simply let the children read, let them hear let them hear stories. Sorry. Not choked up, just swallow drop. And so I worked on that, and I have been working in that area now for a long time. And I have no more credentials, I guess, to do that than most people, but I'm doing it anyway because I believe in it. And having been a writer for children got me into running for the school board, I think. And having been on the school board led me to being unwilling to turn my back on all those issues once I got off the board. And I just kept going. And all these years later, most of the teachers I started working with have retired. They're more logical people.
That's right. Well, we're out of time, but shifting gears briefly, in an earlier interview, you stated something that to the effect that you thought the southwest part of the state of Missouri has the people who live here have a unique sense of place, I think is the phrase from the interview. I'm new to the Ozarks. This is my 3rd year, but I agree that there's something unique about this place, this corner of the state. What do you think it is, and why is it?
Partly I think that goes back to the original settlers of this area. I've heard Dwayne Meyer speak to this several fascinating occasions. But some of those Scotch-Irish immigrants migrating down through Appalachian Valley and strolling over this way and settling. And because of the Ozark terrain, a lot of families were fairly isolated, small communities, didn't communicate a lot with the rest of the world. And I don't know if it's true, but I read somewhere several years ago that some of the so-called hillbilly lingo, dialect, comes closer to Elizabethan English than you can find in England these days, because it's just been an isolated area. Now, that's all changed. There are fewer and fewer families who you can't find. When I was a child, there were some living way back in the woods, but nevertheless, we have a sort of a secular sense of humor, and there have been some wonderful collections, as I know you know, of Ozark lore and stories, and we pass those down. Somebody on the internet today said, this is what I remember about my grandmother. What do the rest of you remember about your grandparents? And I went back and checked it an hour later, and there must have been 50 or 100 people just bang, 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 talking about their families. That goes on everywhere, but ours is ours, and it's very, very unusual.
Yeah. You have at least one Kindle book out there that you are sort of self-publishing. What's the story behind that? Was that a lark? Was it a calculated business decision? What's going on there?
That was sorry. Well, you're looking at the lake behind me, and I love this lake. We've been here 25 years. I'm looking at every morning when I get up for coffee. It's still dark. I don't turn lights on. I wander through the house so that I can see if there's anything stirring around out there in the dark. This morning, as the sun was coming up, there was a spider web, a great big spider web out here over one of the tables behind me, and I immediately came back, got my camera, and went out and took pictures, and I'll be posting it. So A, I'm a biologist. And B, I'm a writer, and C, I love this lake, and I've been observing it now for a quarter of a century. I've got notes that you wouldn't believe. So there came a time when I thought, I have to write something about this. It doesn't even have a name. It's just Lake 3 in Southern Hills. So I called it Goose Lake, and so I don't know if anybody objects to that, but for my purposes. And I wrote a book of poems, both prose and poetry, about the things I observe on Goose Lake. I think it's a pretty good book. I worked hard at it. But I didn't know if it would be possible to sell that to a nationally. I just work with national publishers. And so if you're, especially if you're a New York one, you're not looking for poetry about a small lake in Springfield, Missouri.
Lake number 3.
Not even Goose Lake. So I knew going in that there would be no way I could sell this material to a national publisher. And I had been curious about this ebook stuff. So I thought, okay, this is the time to test that and find out. And so yes, I have one ebook. It's not selling very well. Thank you very much.
Well, I bought a copy last night. I haven't read it yet, but I bought a copy. It was one click, $1.99.
Yeah, I'm not too bad.
I'd go for it. Well, I want to thank you again for consenting to this interview this morning in your beautiful home on Goose Lake, Lake number 3. Is there anything else you'd like to add?
Well, I'm delighted to be invited to do this, Tom, and thank you so much for preserving a little bit of me for somebody somewhere along the line to look at and to listen to. I've had a wonderful experience as a writer and as an advocate, and I hope I'm not anywhere near the end of it, but we've got this much down anyway.
Well, thank you very much. I saved the best or the worst for last because I wanted to make sure we could edit it out if we need to. So I noticed on your website you have Word of the Month. And the Word of the Month for September 2014 is bubble.
Yes.
Now, I'm not a writer. I write academic stuff, which is, pretty much awful prose, no matter how just taken in the aggregate. So I came up with a 3-line poem. It has a near rhyme, at least, I think. So,
wow.
But I don't think it follows any of the rules of scanning. not even a haiku, but I'll read it to you. I'll read it aloud just so
As it should be.
it becomes part of the record here. So, don't have a title for this poem, but 3 lines. The trouble with bubbles is they pop or not.
I see you've had this hidden in you all these years.
Well, we got it on tape now, so I'm going to get an agent, and I'm not going to sell anything for $300. That's what I've heard.
Did you happen to see my bubble poem yesterday?
No, I haven't seen it.
Well, I wrote a takeoff on Macbeth's witches.
Well, I was thinking first double trouble, toil.
Yeah, but I took them away from the pot and gave them a crock pot. And so it's a recipe for modern mothers to clean out the refrigerator.
You get started on your way to work, and you come home, and you've got a witch's brew. All right. Thanks very much.
Thank you.